In today's lecture, we are going to learn about balance sheet. Okay, so this balance sheet, it is included in financial management of agribusiness management. So this balance sheet part is included in your practical syllabus as well as in your theory syllabus. Okay, so we see different points in balance sheet. Okay, so first of all, meaning of balance sheet. Okay, so this balance sheet is also called as net worth statement. That means another name of balance sheet is net worth statement. For objective type question, it may be asked. Then definition of balance sheet. So basically, this balance sheet is nothing but it is a financial statement which shows the financial position of a farm business at a particular time period is known as balance sheet or net worth statement. Okay, so basically this balance sheet is a statement which shows the financial position of a farm business at a particular time period is known as a balance sheet. Okay, this is the definition of balance sheet. After definition of balance sheet, next point, the components of balance sheet. So there are major three components of balance sheet. In that first one, that is asset, second one is liability, and third one is equity. Okay, so assets, these are the things which are owned by the farmer is known as asset, whereas liabilities, these are all the things which are owed by the farmer to the other. And equity, it is nothing but the difference between assets and liability is known as equity. So these are the three components of balance sheet. We see in detail about these components. So first, that is asset. So asset, the definition of asset, things which are owned by the farmer is known as asset. That means whatever the things which are owned by the farmer is known as asset. Okay. Then different types of asset. So there are major three types of assets. In that first one, that is current asset. Second one, intermediate asset, and third one, that is long-term asset. Okay. So first one, that means according to liquidity of asset, this classification of asset is done on the basis of liquidity. So first type of asset, that is current asset. So these current assets are very liquid form of assets, and these current assets can be converted into cash form within a shorter period of time. Okay, this is the current asset. For example, in case of current asset, that is cash in a hand, then agricultural produce like food grains, then milk produce, etc. are included in current asset. That means in case of current asset, we can convert this current asset into cash from within a short period of time. Okay. After that, second type, that is intermediate asset. So these intermediate assets are required longer time period than the current asset to convert into cash form. For example, machineries, equipments, livestock are included in intermediate asset. Okay, so this intermediate asset required longer time period to convert into cash form. After that, last type of asset, that is long term asset. So these long term assets are also known as fixed asset. So these long term assets are required larger time period to convert into cash form. For example, land, then farm building, etc. are included in long term asset. And in case of long term asset, the procedure, that means conversion of these assets into the cash form, requires some sort of procedure, and this is the lengthiest procedure, so it requires larger time period to convert into cash form. So these are the three types of asset, that is current asset, intermediate asset, and third one is long term asset. Okay, so these are the first component of balance sheet, that is asset. These are the things which are owned by the farmer is known as asset. After assets, second component, that is liability. Okay, so liabilities are nothing but all the things which are owed to other by the farmer is known as liability. Okay, so as like assets, there are also three types of liabilities. In that first one, that is current liability, second one is intermediate liability, and third one is long term liability. That means on the basis of repayment period of that particular liability, these liabilities are classified into three classes. Okay, so first of all we see the current liability. So current liabilities can be repaid within the period of 1 year or 1.5 year. Okay, for example, short term loan are included in current liability. Okay, all the short term loan or crop loan are included under current liability. After current liability, second type, that is intermediate liability. So these intermediate liabilities can be repaid within the period of 3 to 5 years. Okay, that means this liability can be repaid within 3 to 5 years, and all the medium term loan are included in intermediate liabilities. Okay, after that, last type, that is long term liability. So these long term liabilities can be repaid within the period of 5 to more than 20 years. Okay, so all the long term loans are included in long term liability. So these are the different types of liability. After liability, next component, that is equity. Okay, so equity, the definition of equity, it is the difference between total assets and total liability is known as equity. Okay, so total assets minus total liability is equal to equity. So if the liabilities are more than asset, then we call as a net deficit. That means if equity is negative, then we call as a net deficit. And if assets are more than liability, then it is called as a net worth. That means when the difference between assets and liability is positive, then we call as a net worth. Okay. When liabilities are more than assets, then it is called as net deficit, and when assets are more than liability, then it is called as net worth. Okay, so these are the three different components of balance sheet. After that, next point, that is position of assets, liability and equity in a balance sheet. So position of these assets, liability and equity is fixed on a balance sheet. So while preparing balance sheet, care must be taken. Always assets are written on left side of balance sheet. That means whenever you start to write your balance sheet, it is must to write all the assets on left side of a balance sheet. Then position of liability, that means liabilities are written on right side of a balance sheet. Okay, assets are written on left side, whereas liabilities are written on right side of a balance sheet. Then if there is net worth means when assets are more than liability, then we call as a net worth. And if there is net worth, then this net worth is written on right side below the liability. Okay, if there is net worth, then it is written on right side below the liabilities. And if there is net deficit means when liabilities are more than asset, then this net deficit is written on left side below the assets. Left side below the assets. Okay, so this is the position of assets, liability, net worth and net deficit. Assets are always written on left hand side, liabilities are always written on right hand side, net worth is written on right hand side below the liabilities, and net deficit it is written on left side below the assets. Okay, so both sides are balanced, hence it is called as a balance sheet. That means asset side as well as liability side, both sides are balanced, so this statement is known as balance sheet. Okay, after this position, next one, that is analysis of balance sheet. So this balance sheet can be analyzed with the help of different test ratios. Okay, so these are the different test ratios which are used for analysis of balance sheet. We see one by one these different test ratio. In that first ratio, that is current ratio. Okay, so current ratio, formula for current ratio is equal to current asset divided by total current liability. Okay, total current asset divided by total current liability, we are getting current ratio. This current ratio indicates the capacity of farmer to meet the immediate financial obligations. Okay, that means this current ratio indicate the capacity of farmer to meet immediate financial needs, and this indicate liquidity within the 1 year. That means this current ratio indicate liquidity position of farm within the 1 year, and if this current ratio is more than 1, then it indicate favorable run of business. Okay, this is the first ratio, that is current ratio, total current assets divided by total current liability, and if this current ratio is more than 1, then it indicate favorable running of business. Okay, after that second ratio, that is intermediate ratio. So this intermediate ratio, formula for intermediate ratio is equal to total current asset plus intermediate asset divided by total current liability plus total intermediate liability. Okay, so this intermediate ratio is equal to total current asset plus total intermediate asset divided by total current liability plus intermediate liability. This intermediate ratio is also known as working ratio. Okay, intermediate ratio is also known as working ratio, and this working ratio indicate the liquidity position of farm business over an intermediate period ranging to 2 to 5 years. Okay, so this intermediate ratio indicate liquidity position of a farmer from 2 to 5 years. Okay, and similarly, if this intermediate ratio is more than 1, then it indicates sound running of business. Okay, this is the second ratio, that is intermediate ratio. After that, third ratio, that is net capital ratio. So net capital ratio is equal to total assets divided by total liability. Okay, so these total assets are nothing but summation of current asset plus intermediate asset plus long term asset, whereas total liabilities is the summation of current liability, intermediate liability and long term liability. So this net capital ratio is equal to total assets divided by total liabilities. This net capital ratio indicate solvency position of a farmer. If this ratio is more than 1, then the funds of institutional agencies are safe. That means if this net capital ratio is greater than 1, then it indicate whatever the loan or funds which are taken from institutional agency, that funds are safe. That means farmer is capable to repay his entire loan amount within a stipulated time period. That is net capital ratio. After net capital ratio, next one or next ratio, that is current liability ratio. So this current liability ratio is equal to total liability divided by owner's equity. Okay, so this current liability ratio indicate farmers immediate financial obligation. Okay, so this indicate farmers immediate financial obligation, and if this ratio is less than 1, that it indicate healthy performance of business. Okay, current liability ratio, if it is less than 1, then it indicate healthy performance of business. This is the current liability ratio. After that, next one, that is debt equity ratio. So debt equity ratio is equal to total debt divided by owner's equity. Okay, so from its name you have to remember the formula of debt equity. So debt, it is the first word, so write total debt on upper side, and equity, it is the second word, so write owner's equity on lower side. Okay, so this is the total debt upon owner's equity, that is debt equity ratio. This debt equity ratio indicate capacity of farmer to meet long term commitments. That means whatever the commitments of farmer to repay the loan amount within a stipulated time period, that commitment can be fulfilled by that particular farmer, it indicated by this debt ratio. Okay, Okay. If this debt equity ratio is less than 1, then it indicates healthy performance of business. That means if debt equity ratio is less than 1, then and then only it indicates sound running of business or healthy performance of business. Okay, this is the debt equity ratio. After debt equity ratio, next ratio, that is equity value ratio. Okay. So equity value ratio, formula for equity value ratio is equal to owner's equity divided by value of asset. Okay, owner's equity divided by total asset is the formula for equity value ratio, and this equity value ratio indicate productivity gained by the farmer in relation to assets he has. That means whatever the productivity of farmer along with its assets, that can be indicated by this equity value ratio. And this equity value ratio, if it is less than 1, then it indicates sound running of business or healthy performance of business. Okay, so these are the different test ratios which are used for analysis of balance sheet. Okay, so next one, that is hypothetical example of balance sheet. So in this picture we can see the balance sheet, how this balance sheet is prepared. So see in here, assets, these assets are right on left side, whereas liabilities are right on written on right hand side, whereas the total, these are the current assets, then intermediate asset, long term assets, these are the written on this side assets, and here the current liabilities, long term liabilities are written on right hand side. Okay, so this is the example of balance sheet. Okay, so question may be asked on this topic, like define balance sheet and explain in detail about balance sheet. Okay, so many of time the short notes on ask, write short note on balance sheet, and in case of practical there is numerical calculation on this balance sheet. That means you have to find out different test ratios from the given data or given values. Okay, so this is all about today's session, that is balance sheet. Okay, thank you all.